Lord Clarke, just dealing still for a short period with BPL. You've described in your statement, and I'm not proposing to go through the documentation in relation to this, your involvement when there was a significant request for a significant increase in funding. Basically, large amount of extra money, some 10 million or so, I think, sought in the first instance, roughly.
That was bound to come to me.
You became involved, and as you said, the Permanent Secretary, Sir Kenneth Stowe, became involved. I think you had a meeting with the one of those involved with the CBLA, hauled into the office, so to speak, and asked to explain what was going on. The question I just wanted to ask you to consider is this. We can see from the various parliamentary statements that you or others made that the expected date of completion shifted. So it went from the end of 1985 to the beginning of 1986 to sometime in 1986. And then I think by the time you left office, beginning of 1987 was the expectation. Do you have any thought as to whether the lack of proper cost control, and you describe it as does, I think, Sir Kenneth in fairly scathing terms, both in terms of the developers and the department's own lack of control over the issue?
Well, that was me trying to put the pressure on for them to think what they were doing and get control over it. That's why in the documents I may have used scathing terms.
Do you have any sense of whether that contributed to the delays in the redevelopment?
No, the delays were probably just they underestimated. I mean, it happens, I say, you name me a major capital building project in the health service, but it didn't happen in the 1980s, and it does today. Just think of some of the major projects we've got, you know. I won't take a big one like HS2. We all know what's happening to it. It's just something about the management of public sector building projects. As it happens, the delay to the blood products laboratory made absolutely no difference whatever to the infection of patients, because long before it was finished, we'd started heat treating the blood products, the factor 8, so people were no longer getting infected with HIV and AIDS. But it was still very wise to move on to protect us against future risks, to move to be self-sufficiency. And by the standards, I'm afraid, I'm being too cynical, by the standards of major public spending capital projects, it wasn't actually that spectacularly over cost and over time. They were far worse. But I don't think it made any difference to the subject matter of this inquiry.
And without going into the detail of the sums involved, broadly speaking, the department and the Treasury, as I understand it, did decide to pay.
Yes, it was never held up for financial reasons. We had no choice really, unless you were going to suddenly start abandoning the policy altogether. We got so far that we could grumble and try to get them to exercise greater control in future, but they got the money, and it was just built over cost and a little late.
So I want to come next to your second period in office as Secretary of State for Health. This was from the 25th of July 1988 to the 1st of November 1990. And as I think you explained yesterday morning, Lord Clarke, this was now simply the Department of Health, not the Department of Health and Social Security. That's right. Two separate departments. And then in terms of the more junior ministers, the Minister of State in the Department of Health, so the role that you'd originally performed in the period we've just been looking at, was David Mellor from July 88 to October 89, and then Virginia Bottomley. And the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State was Edwina Curry for a period in 1988, then Roger Freeman, and then Stephen Dorrell. And I think you've identified in your statement, in terms of Parliamentary Under Secretary of State in the Lords, Lord Trafford for a very short period of time, and then Baroness Hooper.
Baroness Hooper, and Virginia Bottomley was there as well, I think.
Yes,
right?
I think I've mentioned her.
Yeah, she was
Minister of State.
She did social services. That's what Virginia. She did other things as well, but her main thing was social services.
When you arrived back in
as you say, David Mellor was the nearest equivalent to the job I'd previously done.
Yeah, well, it was David Mellor and then Virginia Bottomley.
And then Virginia, that's right.
And you've given the dates in your statement. To what extent, when you arrived back in the department in 1988, had there been any changes, leaving aside the huge change of no longer being social security, being a Department of Health, had there been any changes that you detected in the way in which it operated, or the way in which the civil servants operated, the ministers were briefed?
I can't remember anything too startling. No, I don't think so. I think my predecessor had quite a difficult time there, John Moore.
And that was John Moore, I think. And then can we just go to your second statement? Seamus, it's WITN 0758012. If we go to the bottom of the second page, you've talked about the immediate topic on the agenda being NHS reform. If we go to the top of the next page.
That was the dominant issue and activity of my period of office.
And I just want to ask you about what you say in the last sentence of this first paragraph. You say, I was also conscious of the fact that control of the NHS through Whitehall was over-centralised and there was a need to separate policy and operational decision-making. What did you mean by that in terms of the department?
Well, I say yesterday we had, I think it was the Department of Health on its own, had about 6,000 plus civil servants who, and we were spending quite a lot of them were spending their time second-guessing decisions that were being made in Wakefield, and they were in no really very good position to second-guess them, because all the criticism and all the rows all seemed to come back to us, and the system kind of encouraged channeling them in. And some of the decision-making that I tried to introduce was one of the phrases I tried to use, slightly not particularly political phrases, was responsibility downwards and accountability upwards. I wanted more responsibility for decision-taking to be moved down to the people actually on the ground, though you had to change the management structure and get rid of this consensus management so you could actually have a sensible business-like management structure locally, and then you gave them more responsibility for taking their own local decisions on how they developed services, where they provided them, and all that. At the same time, as you devolved it, what matters the centre was, as I say, accountability upwards. So you held them to account, that's one of your jobs in the centre, and I was particularly anxious that we got into a mood where, by what we meant when we were holding them accountable, was what is the quality of the patient care you're delivering? What improvements in patient care, what benefits are the patients getting from the way you're running the health authority? So I'm sorry to give you a little speech, but that was what that little phrase, Whitehall was, control of the NHS through Whitehall was over-centralised. I've given you a slightly more detailed explanation of what the idea I particularly had got, the BI got in my bonnet on that.
And then, can you recall whether, for the second period in office, relationships between the Department of Health and the devolved administrations in particular?
I don't think it was any different.
No, you've anticipated the question.
I
You can't recall any
I really do not recall having anything to do with the health service in Scotland, and I don't remember much in Wales either.
Now, if we look at WITN 0758013, you will see, Lord Clarke, that this is a minute dated the 6th of December 1988 in relation to a proposal to establish a new advisory committee, the Advisory Committee on the Virological Safety of Blood. And it's copied to your private office, as I understand it. I think that's the name, Mrs. Goldhill, we see there would be your private office. Is that right?
Yep.
And then if we go to WITN... Sorry, no. I've got two references for it. Let me try both of them. WITN 075... No, try this one. PRSE 0003956. Sorry, Seamus. Yeah. So we can see this is the submission Ministers are asked to agree that a new body to advise the health departments on the virological safety of the blood supply should be set up. And then we can see under the heading background, it says screening of blood donors is important both for the safety of blood used in transfusion and for the safety of blood products made from donated plasma. Historically, the blood transfusion services have adopted new screening procedures in an ad hoc fashion in response to advances in clinical knowledge. In some cases, the advice of specially constituted expert groups has been sought, e.g. as with hepatitis and AIDS. Concern to maintain the safety of the blood supply has been heightened by the greater public and clinical awareness of the potential for viral contamination and the new developments in product liability legislation. There's then, under the heading Interested Parties, a description of various other bodies involved in issues relating to the blood supply. I'm not going to ask you about that, but if we go over the page to the heading Need for a New Advisory Body, paragraph 7 says, decisions on testing for particular viruses involve a range of disciplines. Clinical and scientific expertise must be balanced by expertise representing the practicality and cost benefit of testing. Neither the, and then it refers to the three of the existing bodies, the Committee on the Safety of Medicines, the Central Blood Laboratories Authority, or the Blood Transfusion Service, have the remit or expertise to take this broader approach. Their conflicting interests are ultimately in no one's best interest. The new advisory body will embrace the expertise of all interested groups. Its remit will be to advise on measures to minimise virological contamination whilst maintaining adequate supplies. It will therefore embrace the cost-benefit concept. Paragraph 9, there is no suitable existing body. All of the UK must be covered. And then if we go towards the bottom of the page, under the heading Early Tasks, the new body will be able to advise on current practice and policies for screening for infections, which include the following. And you'll see that they includes hepatitis B, non-A, non-B, CMV, and so on.
All
and then
right.
over the page, paragraph 13 is the decision that sought. Ministers are asked to agree that the new body should be established with the remit. Now, this was, as you'll see from that, essentially the first time a body with this overarching oversight of the safety of the blood supply was established. Do you have any views on whether it would have been a good idea to have a body such as this much earlier on, so that you could have drawn on it in the difficult decisions being taken in 83?
Well, you can debate that if you like. I mean, with the wisdom of hindsight, you obviously could argue it would have been useful to have had it a few years before, but you can say that about practically everything. I mean, people do make worthwhile changes and reforms as things move on. It reads as though it was an extremely good idea to have this. As it happens, of course, it was being set up after the worst example of infected blood supplies had already done its worst, and we'd suffered the tragedy. But yes, I mean, plainly, we never know. It might well have, probably would have been very helpful if we'd had this committee some years before. But in all kinds of areas of life, you can say that. Once you've made a change and something's been improved, you can, quite often, if it works, find people saying, "Oh, if only we'd had this 10 years ago," in every kind of way of life.
And we'll look probably tomorrow at one of the issues with which it was particularly concerned, which was the introduction of screening in relation to hepatitis C. But I'll come back to that.
Hepatitis C, yes. We somehow got more aware of hepatitis is always there, it is today. But hepatitis, as we got past the dreadful AIDS crisis, hepatitis began to be more important, as it were, in the discussions and to dominate the discussions more, yeah.
Now, what I'm going to be asking you about really for the rest of today's session, Lord Clarke, is about the Mcfarland Trust, funding for the Mcfarland Trust, and then about the HIV haemophilia litigation. And just so that you understand why those questions are being asked, Lord Clarke, part of this inquiry's terms of reference is not simply to look at how people came to be infected, but to look at the government's response, including the issue of financial support.
Well, yes, I mean, it was set up because the government, 30 years later, was still facing these campaigns for more money. And so they've slightly passed that to you, which is not an enviable... Whatever you ask will be regarded as by some campaigners as not enough. That you get used to that in the field of health. If you're a health minister or an education minister, you might have the naive belief that when you give people money, they will say, thank you very much, God bless you, Mr. Clarke, or something. In fact, whenever you give anybody money, the immediate response of the lobby is, it's not enough. And they try and get more. And we're still facing that today.
Now, the Mcfarland Trust itself was established prior to you taking up your appointment in July of 1988.
Yeah, I don't remember being involved in setting it. It wasn't a government body anyway, I don't think, was it?
No, and again, so that others following understand, the announcement of the £10 million, what was called ex gratia payment to the Mcfarland Trust was made in November 1987 by the then Minister of State for Health, Tony Newton. So some months before you then became Secretary of State for Health. Did you, when you then became involved, and you did fall to you to take some decisions about or be involved in decisions about whether to provide extra funding, did you gain any understanding as to why it had been decided to establish an ex gratia payment scheme via a charitable trust?
I think because, not personally, I've never met anybody who doesn't feel sympathy with each individual victim of this tragedy, with so many people dying of AIDS or hepatitis in particular, when we had this problem of infected blood products. So, the desire to do something to at least alleviate any financial problems, which might be one of the consequences of the loss which people had suffered, had obviously been the motivation. You had to be careful because it's impossible. There's no way of saying what is the right figure. You can only seek to help. And the Mcfarland Trust seems to have been chosen as the vehicle to make the individual decisions about how to distribute it. But I don't think, particularly, I think that was fairly obviously the reason for setting up the Mcfarland Trust.
But did you gain any understanding of why that particular mechanism of a charitable trust had been chosen?
I don't think I ever asked, so it seemed a perfectly reasonable way of doing it to me.
The point at which you were then first asked to become involved, and we'll look at the chronology of events in a moment, but do you recall there ever being any attempt by the department to ascertain the actual needs of those who'd been infected, or in particular their financial
Well, I think
needs?
my understanding, you tell me, because I wasn't close, it's like being Secretary of State in the middle of all the rows I was, that they were spending a high proportion of my time on the Mcfarland Trust. Every now and again, I got myself involved and touched on it because it did involve, the difficult questions of making ex gratia payments out of our budget. But so I don't really know, but it seemed to be a perfectly satisfactory mechanism. Leave it to them to distribute it. They were accepted, I think, by the families involved.
Did you have any expectation as Secretary of State for Health that the Mcfarland Trust would obtain approval for its policies from the department, or seek?
I don't think I'm not sure. I know. I think I said in my evidence. I think it was independent of the department, wasn't it? It wasn't accountable to the department. I don't think.
And there was a.
The only time we seemed to have got disturbed by it was when we gave it extra money, and then people started complaining because it was very, very slow in distributing it. And there appears to have been a debate within the haemophiliac world as to whether the Mcfarland Trust should be trying to assess the individual needs and hardship of victims and their families, or whether everybody should get a share and the same sums should go to everybody. But I don't think that had anything to do with the government much.
And there was a process whereby a certain number of trustees of the Mcfarland Trust would be nominated by the Secretary of State.
Is that so? I'd forgotten that.
Was that something you were ever directly involved in?
I don't remember. I might have been.
Can we then come to, I think that there was a publication in October 1988 of a newspaper article, and you asked about being slow to pay out and so on. You asked for information about it. I'm not going to trouble you with that. But if we can then pick up your dealings...
well, the people we thought we were benefiting were willing to complain to us that it wasn't distributing the money.
I'm going to just pick things up in the middle of 1989, so a year in now to your post as Secretary of State. If we look at WITN 0758026, you'll see, Lord Clarke, this is a letter from the Haemophilia Society dated the 12th of July 1989, addressed to you. You'll see by reference to the first paragraph, the context is by this time High Court proceedings
Yes, it was a group who started it, wasn't it? I don't know how many plaintiffs there were.
If we go down just towards the bottom of the page, however, just looking at the last paragraph, it says, the purpose of this letter is to ask the government to now take a compassionate view of people with haemophilia who've been so tragically infected through the use of contaminated blood products. The court actions, which are only now beginning, could take a very long time indeed to reach a conclusion. 149 people with haemophilia have already contracted fully diagnosable AIDS. Of that number, 93 have died. This represents huge personal and family tragedy and loss, leaving widows and fatherless children as well as couples who've lost a child. And over the page...
Sorry, when is this? Was the Mcfarland Trust already set up?
Yes.
Who's this letter from?
From the General Secretary of the Haemophilia Society, Mr.
Oh, I see. Yeah.
And we'll see top of the next page. Thank you.
But they hadn't brought the legal action, had they?
No, individuals brought the legal action.
Yeah, I think they'd taken legal advice and advised not to.
So you'll see in the first sentence there, first paragraph, while we're ever mindful and deeply appreciative of the £10 million granted on an ex gratia payment in 1987, and with which the Mcfarland Trust has been established, that is simply not enough to give people charge over their own affairs, as they so rightly deserve in the circumstances under which they have to live. While then the Mcfarland Trust has been useful over the past 2 years, it cannot take the place of compensation, and in any case is chronically underfunded for the task it has to undertake. We urge you and your colleagues to review the situation whereby those cases will have to drag themselves all the way through the courts in a manner that will be both costly and deeply humiliating for both the litigants and the government. So that's the letter that was sent to you, July 1989. I just want to look at the reply that was sent, in fact, by Lord Trafford rather than you.
I'm saying it, I think yesterday that you get lots and lots. They're not all replied to by the Secretary of State.
And if we look at DHSC 0003989_067. This is a letter of the 21st of August 1989 from Lord Trafford. Thanks you for the letter to you. And then the second paragraph, the Secretary of State shares the great sympathy we all feel, and my ministerial colleagues have often expressed, for all those who've suffered this great misfortune. We demonstrated this sympathy in a tangible way by providing on an entirely ex gratia basis the £10 million grant to the Mcfarland Trust, which you acknowledge in your letter. We were deeply anxious to do whatever we properly could. However, it remains our view, as we indicated in response to your Society's main campaign, that the question of compensation is a matter for the courts to decide, and then reference is made to the proceedings. Two matters, Lord Clarke. First of all, is it right to understand this exchange of correspondence as essentially the government is saying no to the particular plea put forward by the Haemophilia Society?
That seems to be a polite way of declining it, yes. They obviously... Tony Trafford is sort of running it in with the litigation.
And we can see...
And one of the problems that arose when we did eventually top it up was to try to make it clear that this was not... it had to be distinct from settling the legal action. We won't encourage people to keep assuming that somehow we're under a legal liability to pay this. Okay, the problem was it's very difficult to distinguish between this particular group of patients and other campaigns where, again, there have been medical accidents, usually because of lack of medical knowledge and so on. You always have those at any given time. And much as one would like to, you can't just give ex gratia payments or compensate all the people whose treatment hasn't worked or has had undesirable side effects. We did distinguish between haemophiliacs and the others, but it's actually quite difficult. I think the ones that were alive at the time were Valium, which had been overprescribed and given rise to, I think, addiction to far too many people. Intrauterine devices was a very nasty one. which we had a group campaigning about. I mean, other times, I can't remember all the others, it's always happened, they always happened over the years. Thalidomide was another, but I don't think that was at this time, that was later, I think. But the infected blood problem, and haemophiliacs in particular, is just the only example I can think of a campaign that's just been sustained for decades. None of the others have. Now, at the time, it was a great tragedy. It's probably the worst tragedy of its kind, it's arguable, in the history of the health service, of people dying because lack of knowledge of the medical problems we were facing with a new disease. But we wanted to help, but you had to be cautious. You couldn't establish a general principle. I'm sure the present government somebody will start arguing that they should compensate everybody who caught COVID, but they won't be able to do that.
And would it be right to understand from the fact that the second paragraph, so the top paragraph on the screen, refers to you, the Secretary of State shares the great sympathy we all feel. Would it be right to understand that this decision to say no at this point in time to the Haemophilia Society's request for funding would have been a decision to which you'd have been party?
No, I don't think so.
So you wouldn't necessarily expect that this decision to
No, not particularly.
Okay.
I mean, more likely to come to me if Tony had been either minded to or had been advised to start paying another few million. That would have come to me because he wouldn't have felt it's quite within his authority to do that without getting my approval. But this polite declining to increase the 10 million, particularly as I've said, well, it's not exactly a surprising letter to receive. Practically, you give ex gratia payments to anybody in the health service, and the reaction of the recipients will usually be, it's not enough.
I want to then just ask you to look at the way in which a similar request was expressed later in 1989 through a parliamentary debate. It's DHSC 0002939_002, please, Shomek. You'll see this is, I think, in a German debate. In any event, it's 13th of November 1989, and you'll see the speaker on the left is Mr. Patrick Cormack. And then if we go down the page, just a little further down, if you see the long paragraph there, Lord Clarke, beginning, we are dealing with a well-defined and inevitably sadly diminishing group of people. I just want to pick it up.
Is this Patrick saying this still?
This is Patrick saying this, Patrick Cormack. I just want to pick it up just nearly halfway down the paragraph where he says this: no one can give back to those victims the hope of a normal life that was once theirs. No one can remove the uncertainty with which they and their families live from day to day, the uncertainty of when the bell will toll. If any group of people live in the shadow of death, they do. It is no wonder that their story has been described as the most tragic in the history of the NHS. Many of them carry the extra burden of financial hardship or the even greater worry.
Yes, this was obviously at the stage where we had not yet developed. There never has been a cure for AIDS, and there's no vaccine for it either, even today. But eventually they developed a treatment, which meant it wasn't necessarily fatal, and many people with AIDS now live a normal life for years and years and years, having to be treated.
Yes, and you're right, this is long before that.
Yeah.
Many of them carry the extra burden of financial hardship or the even greater worry of not knowing how their dependents will fare after they have gone. Was there anything in that description with which you as Secretary of State would have disagreed?
Not at all.
Now, if we then pick up around this time, November 1989, is the point in time at which you're asked to take decisions about the possibility of increasing funds for the Mcfarland Trust. And we can pick that up at DHSC 0004415_156. This is a note from Mr. Heppel, 7th of November 1989, and it's addressed to Mr. McKeon, so your...
He was my principal private secretary.
We can see it says, this is a short note designed to act as an agenda for tomorrow morning's meeting with the Secretary of State. It reflects discussion between MSH and myself in the light of our meeting this afternoon with Mr. Robert Keyes MP who is also Vice President of the Haemophilia Society. And then it sets out the Minister of State, so I think that's Virginia Bottomley by now, aim to identify proposals which sufficiently meet the aspirations of the Haemophilia Society so that they're prepared to recommend their members not to proceed with legal action, are accepted by the public and, if possible, the campaigners as being an adequate response to the situation of haemophiliacs with AIDS/HIV, do not set any unacceptable precedents for the future, e.g. by implying NHS liability.
Yes, the third is the problem I referred to a minute ago.
Which reflects the best available medical information at the time but turns out later to be wrong, or accepting a duty of care for the approval of particular new drugs. And then if we go over, let me pick it up, bottom of the page. There are then proposals put forward. So the first proposal, increasing the Mcfarland Trust's funds by 2.5 or 3 times over the next 3 to 4 years. And then if we go over the page, the second option, this is the second paragraph, quantifying and making public the average value per family of social support on top of any help from the Mcfarland Trust. This would cover social security and social services, but probably not healthcare. And then third, explaining to the Haemophilia Society the strain that a court case is bound to put on the families concerned and that the government cannot give way on the principle of liability.
So they're Virginia's proposals?
Yes, I think that's right. Or in any event, the civil servants' proposals to meet the objectives identified by Mrs. Bottomley. And then we can see financially, paragraph 4, it said there's no obvious money in our kitty for this year, but we will need to go through the budgets in more detail. Treasury are likely to resist any further claim on the contingency reserve, and then we could find the money in future years by top slicing the...
That's what was done eventually, isn't it? Top slicing other programmes, modestly.
It may be. I'm not sure I'm going to need to ask you about the mechanics, but in any event, as I understand the position both from the documents and your statement, we don't have a record of the meeting that was taking place with you to which this refers. And do you have any recollection of it independently?
No. As before, I don't have much recollection of this. I can remember being involved, but I don't have any recollection of who said what when and figures and things, except what I can extract from the documents.
Well, we can pick matters up then later in November 1989 with a letter that you yourself sent to the Prime Minister. It's at HMTR 601_006.
Yes, because Margaret got quite interested in this as it went along, didn't it? She too was sympathetic to the haemophilia victims and their families.
Lord Clarke, your reference to Mrs. Thatcher has reminded me of a question I wanted to ask before we look at this document. Do you recall in the earlier period with which your evidence has thus far been concerned, your period as Minister of State for Health, 82 to 85, do you recall any particular interest or involvement of the Prime Minister at that stage?
I don't, actually. I don't think she must have been aware of it, because it was one of the things in the newspapers, that it wasn't the biggest controversy we had at Health. I don't recall her at that stage intervening. It's quite clear that at this stage, when we were now dealing with the consequences, she obviously she was minded to be sympathetic if we could be, we couldn't compensate them in full, but to mitigate the problems, the financial problems at least, that some of the families were suffering.
And then if we look at the text of your letter to the Prime Minister, you say, as you're well aware, a fast-escalating campaign is being run on behalf of haemophiliacs with HIV infection, and I thought you would wish to know of my proposals for responding to the campaign in a sympathetic way while containing the consequences for the NHS generally. The fact that about 1,200 haemophiliacs in the UK were infected with HIV through the use of early commercial blood products, mainly American, which were inadvertently contaminated with the virus, most of them at a time when the threat was not appreciated or poorly understood. It is a great tragedy, but it was not occasioned by negligence either on the part of the clinicians involved or on the part of government. Then you refer to the litigation, and then you say, we believe the court will find in favour of the defendants. I'm strongly of the view that the case should go to trial and that we should not take any action that implied an admission of fault. And then in the next paragraph...
That was my view at the time.
Next paragraph, you then refer to the suggestion of an out-of-court settlement and say, I'm against this on 2 grounds. Firstly, however it was presented, there will be an implication that we've accepted liability, and this would have implications for NHS treatment generally. And secondly, the cost consequences would be enormous. You refer to what the likely...
That's if you start paying out full compensation without any negligence or liability.
And then you say, if we were on behalf of this particular group to separate compensation from the need to establish negligence, there's no doubt the department would be joined in other litigious actions involving licensed medicines, surgical devices, and so on. And you give a couple of examples. And then you say, at the last paragraph...
I'm mentioning the two. I probably was reminded of it by this letter. Sorry.
And then you say further, the present system by which medicines are licensed could be undermined if medical experts believe that they may be more open to litigation. They might be unwilling to attest that new drugs or medicines should be licensed, thus depriving patients of the opportunity of benefiting from medical advances. Finally, if we were to offer what would be in effect no fault compensation to this group, we will rightly be accused of inequity. There are many others who, for no fault of the clinicians involved, are damaged as a result of medical treatment. The arguments were fully explored in the Pearson Commission of 1978, and little has changed since then to convince us that they're no longer valid. So you were... Is this right to understand?
Yes, I was anticipating. I mean, they're the reviews I was giving to you minutes ago. They are my views.
And you were opposed to a system of no fault compensation, as is clear from the letter.
I just think it's impossible. I'm sorry to keep referring to it, but it's a bigger... It's quite a similar analogy. I think COVID's the obvious example. If you had no fault compensation, you'd have vast numbers of people who've had COVID who'd all expect to be compensated once they calculated the financial effects on them. And that'd be one way of bankrupting the government, finally, if you did that.
And then if we go to the next paragraph, you say this: however, I do recognise the degree of public sympathy aroused on behalf of this particular group. I therefore believe we need to act quickly to restore some perspective. Can you assist us with understanding what you mean by that?
I'm not sure what I mean by that. I think everybody felt a degree of sympathy. So can we find some? It's almost like saying, can we find some sensible way of at least doing something to help? That's what my understanding is. That's what we were doing throughout these discussions about the Mcfarland Trust.
And so you say one solution which involves no admission of negligence and creates no difficult precedent would be to increase the funds available to the Mcfarland Trust. You will recall we allocated £10 million in 1987 specifically to help those haemophiliacs who were in actual financial need because of their HIV infection, and we made it clear then that the trust fund was not compensation. So you then set out your proposal to Mrs Thatcher. What I have in mind is to announce a further allocation of £20 million. This raises the total provision to £30 million, which is equivalent to an average payment of £24,000 per case. This is in line with the better European schemes, although it is less than the Canadians will announce shortly, and reference is made to that. Our further allocation would be front-end loaded to allow the Trust to give immediate help of £10,000 to each family unit affected, but would also help the Trust to continue on a more generous...
Yes, by this time they've got a compromise between sharing it all out evenly and dealing particularly with those in particular need.
And then the next paragraph says, since any increased allocation could not and should not be tied to any deal concerning the litigation, it's not guaranteed to buy off the action. Even these sums, which will be widely seen as little more than a palliative, will be difficult for us to find within existing resources. However, it should ease the press campaign for a time at least, and if we're successful in the preliminary issues due to be heard in January, the number of plaintiffs could be substantially reduced. I would propose Mrs Bottomley makes a statement in the House about the new cash injection for the Trust. I think it may be advisable to try and do this before the Canadian scheme is made public. Just to understand your thinking in relation to the latter point, was the desire to get in ahead of the Canadian scheme because once the Canadian scheme was announced...
Well, we were bound to be attacked for not giving enough, as I've just said. Indeed, we are still attacked for not giving enough. The plaintiffs in the legal action had no sooner settled and they started denouncing the government for not giving them enough by way of settlement. That's just predictable, I'm afraid. It's human nature. And certainly it is in these sort of political things. And so to have the unfortunate coincidence of making our further offer of help coinciding with the news that the Canadians have just done the same, and unlike other countries, they seem likely to exceed what we've offered, would be an unfortunate way of presenting what we were doing and would have just excited stronger reactions to what we were doing.
And then in the preceding paragraph where you refer to the sums which will be widely seen as little more than a palliative.
Well, that's what will be argued. It's bound to be.
Was that your own view?
Indeed, it still is being argued. That's why we've got this inquiry.
Was that your own view, or were you simply referring to their?
No. It wasn't. My view was that we will. I'm giving you my view. I'm trying not to be. I mean, it's not. I'm not. I am. As I get older, I get more cynical. But I'm not just being cynical. The reality is that whatever we gave will be denounced as not enough. I warn you that if this inquiry announces more money, it will be one amongst those who react to it will be people denouncing them for not giving enough. I mean, it's non-stop, this. And the haemophilia campaigners have a persistence which dwarfs any other campaigners I know. I mean, that's why we're hearing all this almost 40 years later. It just goes on and on. And the government's latest reaction to it is to try to see if an inquiry will handle it for a bit. And we all want to give help. I mean, I've never met, I don't think the man or woman's been born who doesn't feel sympathy for the victims of this dreadful tragedy. Turning it into financial, help is difficult, and the way of the world is that there will always be some people who say whatever you give, it ain't enough, and it will be described as a palliative. And if you're not careful, if you misphrase it, it will be taken as, you see, they admit it was their fault all along, so we've now got to calculate everything we've lost and have a sort of legal measure of compensation. You can't win, which explains the caution you see quite a lot of people exercising about how we respond to the natural human desire to help, but you've got to be careful how you do it. And then, actually, I touch on what didn't happen, actually, in the end, the way you'll set off lots and lots of other patient groups will all assume if you do it for the haemophiliacs, you should do it for us.
To what extent at this stage was the proposal that you're articulating here motivated by a concern to avoid bad press, or to what extent was it motivated by concern for the position of those?
It was motivated by concern for the individuals. I mean, the bad press you've got to watch out for the way you do it. I mean, there's no point in helping and, at least responding to one's own feelings that we, should do something to help if we possibly can. And then again, it might as well mitigate the extent to which you're denounced for it in the press. I say it's with great respect to the chairman, he faces the dilemma we did. I'm sure the expectation of the campaigners is he's going to recommend that a large sum of compensation is now given to the victims. And I just warned him that I better not go down this any further, but he won't find instant joy in doing it, because there'll be then an argument about whether it's enough.
I just want to then pick up what the Prime Minister's response was to your proposal, and we can do that, I think, by reference to CABO 010003_005. I think I've got.
But again, we did make more money available eventually, didn't we?
You did. I'm looking at the decision-making process, Lord Clarke, and your evidence is a convenient way for us to put that into the public domain, and we obviously can't ask Mrs. Thatcher. So this is a minute from Paul Gray, 17th of November 1989, to the Prime Minister. Just want to.
That looks like my underlining, funny enough.
It may be. I don't know. In any event, it talks about that you, Ken Clarke, this evening sent you the attached minute. I think that's the document we've just looked at. With no warning this was coming. There's no evidence it's been cleared with the Treasury. You'll wish to consider the points made in the letter. For the most part, they repeat the dilemma you've recognised in the earlier deliberations this week. Acceptance of liability at this stage would have enormous repercussions, but public pressure for some further action is intense. There's then a reference to correspondence that's been received, including heartrending examples. And then Ken Clarke's proposal for a quick further injection of 20 million may be the right conclusion, but there are counter-arguments. Is it enough? Will it have any effect in buying off pressure or merely encourage demands for more, particularly if it's quickly followed by a Canadian announcement? And so the suggestion is that there should be a discussion involving the Treasury. I'm not going to...
Yeah, John Major was the Chief Secretary of the Treasury who, at that stage... who handled the public spending decisions there.
And then I think there is, I don't think we need to go to it, there is a decision from the Prime Minister to discuss the proposal with the Treasury and with you. And we can pick the picture up next at HMTR 601_008.
She obviously must have expressed some interest in it for me to be doing this minute to the Prime Minister. I suspect, I get my recollection, she was like the rest of us, was anxious to do something if we easily could, if we actually could.
And we can see this is looks like a briefing note. It's from R.B. Saunders. I think it's a Treasury document. So it's addressed to the Chief Secretary to the Treasury.
Yes, it's going to the Chancellor.
And we can see it's dated the 20th of November 1989. It's copied to the Chancellor and others. And it refers to the first paragraph. You're attending a meeting about this with the Prime Minister this afternoon. Genesis is a meeting the Prime Minister is having with the Haemophilia Society. And then paragraph 3 is the recommendation you should support Mr. Clarke's proposal so long as he agrees to absorb the costs, as in paragraph 5.
This is the Treasury reaction. It's wholly predictable. Yes, that's how that's to this day. That's how they react to anything of this kind.
And join him in resisting any pressure for more generous treatment. And then it goes on to talk about what the actual proposal is in relation to
the Prime Minister was obviously sympathetic because she wouldn't normally expect her to agree to a meeting with the Haemophilia Society. She'd ask a health minister to meet them on her behalf, but she herself had obviously got interested.
So is it right to understand that from this the Treasury stance, and you said I think it's probably the typical Treasury stance, fine as long as it comes out of the Department of Health's budget?
Absolutely. Which I tell you is if you have a spending proposal, there's their reaction 90% of the cases, and I think that's what we eventually did. It's one thing you have to bear in mind when you are a health minister. It's too easy to be frightfully generous with other people's money. Every time you do give money, there's some other health expenditure that you're having to hold back or withhold or restrain. You simply can't. There's no such thing as free money. There's no open-ended supply of money to go to.
And then we can see a reflection of the discussion at the meeting between you, the Prime Minister, and the Treasury on the 20th of November 1989 at HMTR 601_012. This is a document from Paul Gray, so from number 10, to so the Prime Minister's private secretary to your private secretary. It's addressed to Andy McKeon. And
we also had a discussion.
Yes. So again, I don't need to go through all of it.
My 20 million suggestion.
Yes. So we can see that there's obviously been a discussion in the course of that afternoon with the Chief Secretary to the Treasury and the Attorney General also present. And I think that's probably Norman Lamont at this stage. And then if we go further down the page...
Yes, John Major wasn't there very long as Chief Secretary. I think by this time Norman Lamont is Chief Secretary.
Yes, I think that's right. And then we can see there's a discussion about the litigation, and then summing up this part of the discussion, the Prime Minister said it was agreed that the issue of whether or not to proceed with a further allocation to the Mcfarland Trust need not be affected by the position reached in the legal proceedings. The issue, therefore, fell to be settled on political grounds. Your proposal is then set out, and you say you propose to find it from within the new departmental budget, resulting from the autumn statement decisions. And then, if we go over the page, top of the page, you're recorded as saying this: £20 million would undoubtedly fall well below the aspirations of those campaigning for additional help. But he, that's you, thought it struck the right balance between the conflicting considerations.
Well, it's impossible to make. You couldn't calculate an exact sum. It's just a question of every individual's judgment of, I wouldn't repeat anything said in the letter. In the end, it's just a question of what feels right and is actually affordable without doing too much damage to other parts of the health budget.
And then, just so that we understand, the reference to conflicting considerations, are those the points we saw set out in some of the earlier documents that we've looked at that you and others had raised?
Sorry, no, what am I being asked?
If you look at that first paragraph, it says, but he, that's you, thought it struck the right balance between the conflicting considerations. And I'm just trying to understand what the conflicting considerations might be. Do you think that's a reference to the issues you've already alluded to, not wanting to set precedents?
Well, what do we say to the people who are pursuing, the groups who are campaigning for what they would describe as compensation for other groups? Yes, you have them all the time. And it's not easy to distinguish the haemophiliacs from other groups of people who had sadly suffered as a result of either medical mistakes, whether you're legally liable if you make a mistake, but other medical accidents when people hadn't been enough scientific knowledge of the full effect of particular medicines or particular treatments. In a rapidly changing health world, with the pace of clinical advance we have nowadays, it happens all the time, and it will continue to happen, and particularly when you have a new disease suddenly crop up.
And then we can see the document continues. In discussion, the following points were raised, and it's the first paragraph here I want to ask you about. In presenting such a package, it would be desirable, as well as avoiding any acceptance of legal liability, to avoid conceding any moral obligation. Rather, the emphasis should be on the special circumstances of this particular case, although distinguishing the position of the haemophiliacs from other difficult cases like vaccine damage was not easy. It was also reasonable to point out that without the treatment they were given with the blood products, many of the haemophiliacs would have died. Your Secretary of State would consider whether information about their life expectancy was available. Can I ask you first, Lord Clarke, about the first sentence? I understand entirely, and I'm not proposing to ask you why at this stage you wanted to avoid acceptance of legal liability. We'll look at the litigation later. But it's also recorded there that it would be desirable to avoid conceding any moral obligation. Why was that seen as important?
It's an odd phrase to use, isn't it, really? I think, with reading the document and interpreting it with hindsight as you are, the problem was to avoid, if we could, conceding that we accepted there was sort of fault on the part of the doctors or the health service or the government, because people don't understand once you start conceding fault, people don't understand why you're not accepting legal liability. Indeed, it is quite difficult to argue that there's no legal liability if you accept there's some fault on your part. Obviously, the thing, as far as possible, the thing to try to make clear was this was being done as a gesture of what we believe to be public sympathy and desire to help if we could, which actually was the desire of the Prime Minister and ministers to help if we could, not to deal with every problem, but to at least give something that might alleviate some of the problems of the families affected. Without trying to overinterpret one phrase, that's how I read it now. That's what I think we're on about here.
And then if we look towards the end of that paragraph, it's recorded as a point of discussion or a point raised, reasonable to point out that without the treatment they were given with the blood products, many of the haemophiliacs would have died. Now, I explored this with you yesterday, Lord Clarke, to an extent, but I want to ask you at this point in time, are you able to assist us with what the factual basis is for what appears to have been your understanding articulated here?
No, I obviously had this. I still have this understanding. My recollection is that haemophiliacs had quite a short life expectancy on average before this prophylactic treatment was produced, and they were at less risk from severe bleeding incidents as they had been. But you'll have to ask a doctor whether that's factually. I remember it's what I thought at the time was factually correct, and what I think was factually correct, and obviously the person in the Prime Minister's office and producing this letter thought was factually correct. Well, as far as I'm aware, it is factually correct, but I don't know. You need a medic to give you a definitive answer to that.
The source of the information recorded here, it's likely to have been you, isn't it, or your department, rather than the Prime Minister's department or Norman Lamont at the Treasury?
Well, it's a doctor, isn't it, somewhere, the original information. It is a medical judgment. I can't remember what the source of it was, why we all believed that. But again, unless you correct me, I believe it. I still think it's true. But I mean, I haven't done research into finding out why it's actually true.
And then it continues, your Secretary of State would consider whether information about their life expectancy was available. I don't think the documents tell us if you did seek or obtain any such information. Are you able to help us in the absence of documents?
No. I couldn't off the cuff start answering questions about the life expectancy of victims.
In your witness statement, so if we go to the second statement again, WITN 0758012, if we go to page 51, we pick it up halfway through the bottom paragraph. You say here, looking back, it seems the amounts offered were the best solution available. There was no mathematical calculation or objective needs assessment. It was an exercise of a broad judgment in which the overall sum of £24,000 per family...
It's about £80,000 in today's money, isn't it?
I think I'm not sure whether that's right. I think you give a different...
I'm not sure whether that's right. I haven't...
In any event,
off the cuff.
In which the overall sum of £24,000 per family seemed to be a reasonable outcome, having regard to the size of the funds that would have to be made available by the department. We shared the widespread public sympathy for the victims of this terrible tragedy, wanted to do what was possible. In the absence of a mathematical calculation or objective needs assessment, was this really an exercise in looking at what kind of amount of money can the department find from its existing budget and spare for the cause?
Well, it's all those things. It's, as I say, in the end, you're making a broad judgment. You know, how much can we find that is likely to be of some help and make a difference to the people affected? You know, what feels reasonable? The best reflection we can afford without doing damage to other possible, you know, expenditure we might engage on worthwhile health activities. How much is it proper, as it were, for us to see if we can find it, to as I haven't said, we weren't compensating everybody for their losses. We couldn't do that. But what that seems to be sufficient enough to make we hope, a difference, to be of some benefit to the families connected. And so you correct me for a while, and I apologise if my maths is wrong, but I seem to recall some of this. It's about £70,000 or £80,000 in 2021 money.
You say in your witness statement the sum of £20,000 represents a little more than £44,000 in...
Oh, do I? Well, in that case, I've got it grotesquely wrong. I correct myself from my witness statement. It's £44,000 in today's money, is it?
To put it in context, in 1989 terms, £20,000 was less than the annual salary for 1 year of a backbench Member of Parliament.
What, the
£20,000 for... I mean,
that was then the annual salary of a Member of Parliament.
Well, it's in fact...
Well, that may well admittedly, because the Member of Parliament nowadays is paid £80,000 a year. So I can't remember what it is. I'm not a Member of Parliament anymore.
£20,000, would you accept, wouldn't begin to provide... To compensate or recognise the kind of financial losses sustained by people who, because of their infection and the desperate consequences for their health, have been unable to work year in, year out.
Oh, yeah, some of them. That's what I'm saying. But if had we lost a legal action, then you would have got down to the assessment of damages. And that would be included, and it's taken a very long time, for every plaintiff, trying to see what particular consequences that plaintiff had suffered, and some financial measure, if you could, of what they lost. I mean, had the government fought the case and lost, we never thought we were going to lose. I don't think the plaintiff's lawyers thought for one moment they were ever going to win. But had we, I mean, conceded or been found legally liable, and that is the kind of calculation you would then have made. And when we paid this, we didn't go out making any sort of great claims saying this should deal with everybody's financial problems and be the right figure for every victim. Sadly, we couldn't do that. And we were not legally liable. And even then, the consequences of starting to pay out full compensation to people whose treatment had gone wrong, regardless of fault. The health service only pays out if someone's found to have been negligent. They're negligent claims. You have to do that. You wouldn't have any money left to run the health service otherwise. And nowadays, it's much worse. We're much more litigious nowadays. Fighting litigation, paying legal costs and compensation is a quite significant percentage of the full health budget nowadays. It's because society is more litigious nowadays. Also because we made, in my opinion, I always thought I was about the only minister who thought it a mistake at the time because I've been in health. We introduced this no-win, no-fee rule that people now sue on. So lawyers, we go around organising cases, they don't charge a fee to the claimant, so anybody can afford to do it, you just have to let them use your name. The lawyer goes on a no-win, no-fee, and either takes a percentage of what you win, or if they negotiate a settlement, takes a substantial percentage of the settlement for the legal costs. I'm sorry I'm going on, but that is the reason why I always anticipated that. That's why we have to be so careful that we mustn't start admitting fault, admitting blame, imputing legal liability. Once you start doing that, the floodgates open, because sadly, the health service cannot guarantee to cure everybody of every ailment for which it gives the best possible treatment in the light of medical knowledge at the time.
If we just move to then...
Sorry, I've given you a bit of a speech, but that is the sort of background to all this.
If we move to DHSC 302536_031...
Sorry, there's another. It's coming up, is it?
It is, yes. DHSC 0002536_031. So this is another letter from Paul Gray at number 10, 22nd of November 1989. It's addressed now, I think, to the, it's Alan Davey, Minister of State's Office, Department of Health. So it's addressed, I think, to Mrs. Bottomley's private office. We can see it refers to a meeting. Robert Key MP this afternoon led a Conservative parliamentary delegation to see the Prime Minister about the position of haemophiliacs who were infected with the HIV virus. It identifies other members of the delegation and then says your minister was also present. So again, as I say, I think that's a reference to Mrs. Bottomley. If we can just go over to the second page, this is the point I want to ask you about. It records the discussion and the various contributions of members of the Conservative parliamentary delegation.
Yeah.
If we then pick it up where it says, fourth paragraph down, the Prime Minister said... The Prime Minister said that the government recognised the need to provide additional assistance. She could not, however, accept the case for action on anything like the scale being suggested by some of the pressure groups, not least because there could be no question of the government accepting legal liability in the run-up to the prospective court proceedings. There was also a major problem in ring-fencing any assistance given to haemophiliacs. And then this, the position was that they had been given the best treatment available on the then current medical advice, and without it, many of the haemophiliacs...
Well, she was obviously being briefed as I was.
Yes. I mean, I've already asked you about the assertion many of the haemophiliacs would have died. And Lord Clarke, just so that you understand, the inquiry has received evidence that would suggest that that is not correct, but it'll all be a matter for the Chair to assess. That's a question for the medics to sort out. But it's the phrase "to the best treatment available." This becomes something of a mantra, Lord Clarke. We can look at it. It appears in other documents. It appears in interviews that you've given over the years. the assertion that they received the best treatment available on the then current medical advice.
Yeah.
Are you able to assist with how it was, or on the basis of what it was, you formed the view that was the factual position, best available medical advice?
Well, on the basis of all the evidence we've been discussing for the last day and a half, it was there was, as always, often again the case, there was this balance of risk. We had begun to realise, though we weren't certain, but there was a possibility becoming ever more probable, that some people were being adversely affected by being given factor VIII because of the infected source that some of the factor VIII was coming from. On the other hand, according to the medics, more people would be damaged, and the quality of life of haemophiliacs very badly damaged if we stopped giving them the factor VIII. And that judgment, we spent a day and a half going through all the expert committees, the meetings of medical experts and specialists in the field. That was the position. Nobody, my understanding remains, is that nobody had a better treatment, prophylactic treatment, for haemophiliacs, and nobody knew, Well, unfortunately, the difference of being with hindsight is we now know that the risk of this contaminated product was absolutely enormous because we discovered that so many people got infected. But no doubt that the inquiry will eventually decide, what was the best judgment that could have been made by the medics of what the risk was.
So this reference to best treatment, or best available treatment, then is a reflection.
What other treatment was there?
Well, can I just ask the question, please, first, Lord Clarke? This is a reflection, is it, of your understanding that there were no alternatives, and that the consequence of not receiving factor VIII concentrates was death or serious
we can't
damage?
go back over it. I don't know whose letter. I can't remember now whose letter this is. But what's then described there, that was broadly the judgment that was taken. That we know that there was that subcommittee when Mr. Galbraith and all that, which we went over yesterday. There were experts, had whole long sessions. Again, the only newspaper report this morning, of course, completely misreports what I said yesterday. Some sub-editors put a headline on the Times saying Clarke says ignored the advice of, it's actually Mr. Galbraith they're talking about. It wasn't ignored. It was considered by some of the best medical experts in the country, with Mr. Galbraith there, and they appear to have come to the conclusion, which they never forward to ministers, that actually the advice he was giving wasn't the best advice, and they had to keep on giving factor VIII. Now, the judgment of that subcommittee, I suspect you couldn't have found globally people with more expertise than the members of the subcommittee and the people they had with them, the experts supporting them. I doubt whether you could have found a group with more expertise as to what was the best way, in the light of current medical knowledge, to treat haemophiliacs. So that's an example of what lies behind this simple sentence, as I think you say Paul Graves repeated in this letter.
I'm just going to observe, Lord Clarke, so that others understand why I'm not going to ask you further questions along these lines. Whether what you've described is an accurate characterisation of the decision-making, in particular on the Committee on the Safety of Medicines Biological Subcommittee, will be a matter for the Chair to decide. And me asking you about your understanding of it's not going to improve that.
Well, we've been over the decision-making.
Which is why I'm not
in
going
considerable
to ask you further
detail
about it. If we go next, just to pick up and complete the decision-making that led to the extra £20 million to the Mcfarland Trust, at CABO 010002 _008.
I mean, we did give this 20 million, didn't we?
Yes. Just want to pick up the handwritten entry at the bottom. You've transcribed it, I think, in your statement, but it says, as I understand it, Prime Minister subsequently discussed the announcement with Mr. Clarke this morning, and it was agreed he would consider the possibility of increasing the initial across-the-board payment of £10,000 within an unchanged £20 million package. I think you say in your statement, sorry, this was agreed to by the Treasurer, you say in your statement you don't recall the detail of how that came about.
No, I mean, my guess, reading that note that somebody's written, is that was the Prime Minister's idea, which he was pressing me to go away and think about doing.
So it's
the words are actually unchanged overall, £20 million
Yes,
package,
sorry.
I think.
Yes, the 20, within the 20 million, but pay more of it quickly up front. It appears to be what the Prime Minister was asking me to consider.
And then if we go to the announcement of the payment, HMTR 601_023. You make the announcement by way of a written answer on the 23rd of November 1989. If we go further down the page, we can see you refer to the initial establishment of the Mcfarland Trust, and then you say, this is the bottom of the left-hand column, Lord Clarke, the Trust has been able to give significant and valuable help to a large number of infected haemophiliacs and their families, but the time has now come to reassess the total sum available to it. The true nature and extent of the needs of the infected haemophiliacs have become much clearer now that the Trust is in operation and has been able to examine individual cases in detail. I am satisfied that the government should now make extra resources available to the Trust. Just pausing there, what did you mean by referring to the true nature and extent of the needs?
I can't remember. It looks though from the haemophiliac, the Trust, the Mcfarland Trust, there had been, they had presumably in distributing it, because they've been looking at individual needs. They'd started by paying out on an individual basis everything, so assessing different individuals. I can't remember the origin of it now, but it looks though we had got some more information about the kind of financial problems that some of the victims and their families were suffering.
And then
I can't remember now what that was based on.
And then we can see the additional payment, it's there recorded as being 19 million, bringing to 29 million the total payments made. The House will appreciate that, as before, this is not compensation, but a payment which responds to a particular and tragic situation. In making this new allocation, the government have two objectives in mind. And then we see the proposal, the individual payment of £20,000 as a one-off payment, and then secondly,
so we had altered to 20,000 each. Yeah.
Yes, and then the rest essentially would be provided on an individual basis by the Trust.
That was a compromise on do you share it all out? Do you look at the particular needs of families?
It appears that if we just look at MACF 602_020. Sorry, wrong document. Oh no, that is the right document. Sorry, Shane. These are the minutes of a meeting, an extraordinary meeting of the trustees of the Mcfarland Trust.
Trustees of the Mcfarland Trust,
yeah. 29th of November 1989. But I'm just picking it up because it refers to a meeting with you. Bottom of the page says, on the 21st of November, the Trust and the Haemophilia Society have been invited to a meeting with the Secretary of State for Health.
I don't remember this meeting.
Scheduled on the Thursday, the 23rd of November. No detailed agenda or papers have been provided in advance of the meeting. Top of the next page. At the meeting, it quickly became clear that the Trust and the Society had been invited to be told the government's intentions only just in advance of an official parliamentary statement and press release. There'd therefore be no negotiation and very limited scope for discussion, though the views of the Trust and the Society have been firmly presented to the extent that the draft statement and press release have been modified. I'm not going to ask you about the details of the draft statement or press release, but is that, and the Trust, the inquiry's heard some oral evidence, I think, from Mr. Waters of the Haemophilia Society of his recollection of what might have been this same meeting. Do you have any recollection of it?
I don't claim I don't have. I've forgotten I've ever had a meeting with the Haemophilia. So this is the Trust, Mcfarland Trust. I don't remember it. But I'm not surprised at what he says. That was, from the point of view of the government, that was a sensible line to take. Otherwise, the moment you had them in and said, we're thinking of giving you X, it would turn into a negotiation.
So it was.
They would say, that's not enough, could we have Y, you know, so it was to give them the courtesy of letting them know in advance before we made the public announcement.
So it was the presentation of a decision that had been made as opposed to a discussion.
Yeah, it's the only way. You can't possibly, well, you could if you wanted, but you'd just be starting a long negotiation if you just called them in to discuss it with them.
And then if we just go back to your witness statement, WITN 0758012.
I mean, if you were in their shoes, you would ask for more, wouldn't you? I would, if I was in their shoes. I was just brought in and told we're thinking of giving you X. I'd say, can't you give us Y?
If we go to page 63, this is of your second statement, Lord Clarke.
And you can't tell them too far in advance because they'll leak it and start briefing everybody that it's not enough. I fear. I'm not being particularly unkind to the Mcfarland trustees. That's part of human nature.
So I just want to ask you about what you say here. Paragraph 43.1, you say, I've been asked to reflect on the increased payments made to haemophiliacs in November 1989 and whether they were an effective response to the financial hardship of those who'd suffered from
Yes, you're correct me. It's the 44,000. I was quite wrong.
So, and just so that people understand, you've been asked by the inquiry and the questions posed to you for your statement to reflect in that way. Your response is 43.2. It seems to me they were a reasonable means of responding to and alleviating suffering and hardship. Sum of £20,000 represents a little more than 44,000 in today's money, which is a substantial sum. It was coupled with the continuing ability of the Mcfarland Trust to make payments on the basis of need and social security assistance. It has to be set against the background of the constraints on public funds and that there were many groups of people who suffered terrible diseases without being able to claim additional support from the state, including other sufferers from AIDS. And then you refer to the argument about whether payments could be ring-fenced. That was your reflection in your relatively recent statement. Does it remain your view that that payment as at November 1989 was an effective response to the financial hardship of those?
It was a mitigation of the financial hardship. It wasn't a measurement of the financial hardship. That is what would happen if you had full liability, legal liability, and you were trying to calculate what was required to give full compensation. This was it's essentially a judgment as to what has the right feel to your judgment and your conscience, and bearing in mind where you're taking the money from. You know, what makes a difference in mitigate the problems caused by the families? Is it sufficient to be helpful and of use, you know, and not so much that you're going to cause outrage to other groups, or you're going to do real damage to some other worthwhile health expenditure that you could embark on?
And it wasn't.
Well, it's bound to be a broad judgment. I think the discussions between ministers that led up to it, it's, you know, what does it feel like? It's about right. There's no way of calculating it.
It wasn't, as I understand it, tied to any actual assessment of financial hardship.
No, that's what you do if you were legally liable, if there was fault on your part. But there obviously is no fault on anybody's part, in my opinion, and I think the plaintiff's solicitors knew that. Though I suspect, I don't know, but I've not seen their advice, but I suspect the plaintiff's lawyers in the legal action felt as confident as we did that it was almost certain that they were going to lose, which is why they started overtures for a settlement, and no doubt were advising their clients that it would be very wise to settle this.
Well, we'll come on to the litigation, sir, perhaps as the next topic after the break.
Just before we do, I wonder if I can clarify the figures with you, Miss Richards, because there may be some who are watching who have wondered and may have listened also to what Peter Stevens had to say earlier when he gave evidence about the Mcfarland Trust. There were, I have been told, 1,200 haemophiliacs who might be eligible for compensation. £20,000 each is £24,000. The sum which Mr. Clarke was proposing was 20 million. 24 million, I should have said. The sum Mr. Clarke was proposing was 20 million. The sum mentioned in Parliament was 19 million. And there is a reference in Mr. Clarke's statement to it having been subsequently increased. not to 24 million, which I thought it might have been the figure, but to 25 million. What was the actual sum paid in the end?
I think we'll have to check that, sir. I don't want to give you an off the top of my head answer, not least because, as you say, there are different figures mentioned in different documents. I'm sure we'll be able to establish.
I think we really, it ought to be a matter of record, even now, despite what may have happened to some records. So if we can have some clarity or certainty about it, it would be helpful.
Now, I can't remember what led to these little adjustments. I've noticed that as we've gone through this questioning, and why will £1 million suddenly vanishes and then, as you say, later comes back. I'm sorry, I can't help. I can't remember what that was all about.
Anyway,
But I do remember. I've tried to explain. On the whole, you knew you weren't calculating the exact figure. It was a broad judgment of what is kind of feels right and what at least helps deal with these sympathy we and most members of the public felt for the victims of the tragedy.
Well, we'll return to the questioning then at 10 to 4, shall we?
Thank you, sir.
10 to 4.